Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the new edition of True Crime with the Sarge. I'm your host, Joseph Giacalone. We have a very exciting guest with us today. Dr. Joni Johnston is a forensic psychologist. Sorry about that. True Crime with the Sarge. I'm your host, Joseph. Sorry about that.
Oh,
I forgot to shut off
please.
my other computer. Dr. Joni Johnston, welcome. Forensic psychologist, private investigator, and author of several books, including her latest 100 The Serial Killers, 101 Questions That True Crime Fans Ask. Welcome to the show, Dr. Joni. How are you?
I'm great. So good to be here, Joe. I've been looking forward
Good.
to this.
Yes, you and I have been on a number of shows together, and now we actually have a chance to sit down and talk one another. And unlike what you have to do with TV and stuff like that, where you're just trying to jump it all over the place, so it's good to finally sit down and speak with you.
Same here. Yeah, it really is.
So for the audience, let's define what a forensic psychologist is, because I know I have a lot of students that do this, and of course I like to do trivia questions, so this could fit right into that, and I'm sure it's a question that you get asked a lot. So could you explain to us what a forensic psychologist is and what kind of education is involved with it?
Yeah, forensic psychologist is obviously it's a subspecialty of psychology, and it essentially is using psychology to try to help the courts answer some legal question. So it's really at the intersection of law and psychology. It's really the best job in the world, I have to say. I absolutely love it, but it really can be very broad. So probably one of the most obvious applications would be if somebody is claiming that they were insane at the time of the crime. I might be called in to investigate and evaluate that person to see if I believe that person is criminally responsible for their behavior. It can range all the way from that to somebody who is saying, I was in this horrible car wreck, I have post-traumatic stress disorder. And so then there's the issue of damages, right? Was this person emotionally distressed? If they are, is it because of the car accident? Or it could be in a divorce proceeding, looking at parenting kind of issues. So it actually has a lot of broad applications, but that's the common denominator is psychology is being used to help the courts make a decision.
And what kind of education? So, if there's a student that wants to pursue forensic psychology, what would they go about? What kind of course of study would they be looking at?
So typically, it depends on the state, but typically you have to be have a doctorate to call yourself a psychologist, and that can vary from state to state. At least in California, that's the case. So a lot of psychologists, do have doctorates. Forensic psychology. When I was in school back in the dinosaur age, there was no such thing as a forensic psychologist in terms of a school. So you would go to school, like I went and got a degree in clinical psychology, got my doctorate in clinical psychology, and then I specialized in forensic psychology. I worked in correctional settings. I took courses and those kinds of things. Now you can completely decide when you're in the 10th grade that you want to be a forensic psychologist, and you can go to a school, major in psychology undergrad, and then you can get your master's and your doctorate in forensic psychology. So it's really changed since I was there.
Right. So it's probably a growing field now because we know that a lot of true crime advocates and true crime aficionados and I know from school the students love this stuff, right? The criminal minds kind of classes, and they really get involved. And I'm sure you, as a forensic psychologist, when you hear some of these things, kind of like when I hear about the cop shows, you're just kind of like, oh boy, here we go, right? That kind of stuff.
It is true, although I will have to say, Jed, that I was a true crime follower before I became a forensic psychologist. So my mom used to watch every show you can imagine, Mannix, all the cop shows as well. Anything with a mystery, my mom was right there. So I still do have to say that I probably listen to more than my share of true crime. But you're right. Sometimes I do sometimes wonder where the information is coming from.
Right, and you also too, when when you watching some of these trials and you hear about them, oh, we on their internet searches they found this. I said, oh my God, if they ever looked at ours, right, they thought we were good grief,
But you have to
good
think of the
grief.
context, Joe, right? Context is everything.
Yeah, it's like kind of like if I tell my wife, if I happen to drop dead before you do, make sure you delete my cache, because if not, boy, they're gonna have some serious issues on your hands. So let's get into your new book. So 100 serial killers, 101 questions that true crime fans ask. I can only imagine why you wrote this book, because everybody's asking you all these questions. But there's a couple of things that I pulled out that I thought were kind of unique. Now, the Nightbot is sending out the links for your website, for Dr. Joni Johnson's website, and also for this book on Amazon. You can find the link. Plus, when you're on Amazon, you can see the other books that she's written too. One thing that kind of struck me, I guess not odd, but I guess it is a very big state, but California leads, let's put it this way, leads the league in serial killers. which I guess because of the population is huge and that kind of
Mhm.
stuff is probably one of the reasons. But is there anything when you're doing your research or learning about this stuff that you kind of like say, wow, this is something unique?
I think that's such an interesting question. I mean, I do think for the most part, as somebody who lives in California and feels the need to somewhat defend my state, I think population does have most, provides most of the answer to that because, as a matter of fact, really the most dangerous state in terms of serial killers, if you're looking at just like the number of serial killers per population historically, is Alaska. So, there's a lot of factors you can look at California. I mean, Alaska, for example, it being, the population is much less. It's less supervised in some respects. It's kind of the wilderness and all kinds of things. So even though California has had the most serial killers for sure, and I do think it's population related, it's not necessarily the most dangerous from a per person point of view.
Right. So and there's the Nightbot link for those that are looking for Dr. Choni's book. You can pick it up there. Yeah, no, I figured population probably definitely has something to do with it, but you can also look at other states that have a big population like New York, which we're going to get into in a little bit when we get into Rex Heuermann, because he probably upset the whole apple cart over there in New York State. But Texas might be another one, right? A big population state, right? And wherever you have the most senators, I guess, and congressmen, that's where you're going to have the most serial killers. I guess we could start making an analogy for that. But yeah, so I found like the California thing was kind of interesting. But let's get into some of the other facts that we're getting into. What would be the profile of a serial killer, right? Like, so I guess the gender and the age and that kind of stuff. What would be the mold? I know it's changed kind of differently from the 70s and 80s when they first started studying this stuff. Everybody was driving a Volkswagen back then, not so much today. But what are we looking at?
It is interesting because demographically there have been some changes over the years, and if you look back as far as as early as like 1900, we see a dramatic difference. So, for example, we know now that a little bit over 90% of serial killers are men, so a little
Mhm.
bit less than 10% are women. Back in 1900s, the percentage of serial killers who were women was about 35%. Believe it or not, which that is huge when you think
Yeah.
about the fact that men tend to murder, and 90% of murderers are men. So one of the theories for that is that as women have gained economic freedom in the 19, they got the vote, they could own property, they could work. The number of men who were murdered by serial killing women went down. So if you look at it that way, Joe, we can kind of go, anything that's a woman's right is kind of a man's right too,
Yeah.
at least from that perspective. So we
Right.
know that 90% of serial killers today are men. Demographically, they tend to be in their mid to late 20s up into 40. That's been pretty consistent. We've seen somewhat of a shift racially. Um, since 2014, about 60% of serial killers have been African American. That's different from from what we tend to think as most serial killers as being Caucasian. So that's been a little bit of shift there. I'm trying to think what other things have shifted that we've seen. I mean, I think the other thing to talk about is when we talk about a profile of a serial killer, you and I both know how broad that definition is. I mean, a serial killer as of 2005 is somebody who's killed two or more people in separate events, with there being some time period in between. We don't tend to think, for example, of the Black Widow, the woman who kills one husband and then she goes on and marries another husband and she kills him for money. We don't tend to think of that person as being a serial killer, but we know that that is a serial killer because the definition is not based on motive. It's based on number of victims and the time between victims. So it's hard to kind of go, what we tend to talk about when we talk about serial killers is the sexually motivated serial killers, like allegedly Rex Heuermann, like Ted Bundy, like John Wayne Gacy, like Dahmer. I mean, the ones that we all know, the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez, and all those.
Right. Yeah, we definitely want to get into the Rex Sherman thing, but since you brought that up, I do have a question for you. When you're talking about this motivation of sex, right? It doesn't actually mean the exact act, right? It's just something that I guess it's a driven kind of thing, or is it just for the act?
No, I think that's a very good point. I mean, there's a whole issue of sex. Even when we're talking about sexual offenses, oftentimes, even with the act of sex itself, it can be very blurred between violence and sex. And so when you're talking about a sexually motivated serial killer, you can be talking about somebody who's doing all kinds of sexual, what we consider sexual things to a victim. But you can also find things like picurism, which is somebody who gets sexually satisfied by stabbing somebody. It becomes kind of a symbolic thing for them. Oftentimes you get more clues from who the victim actually is than you might the actual act. There's also a lot of sexual sadism oftentimes involved in sexually motivated serial killers. So they may get some sexual gratification from the pain and suffering of that other person, which is the most horrible thing to think about. I mean, it's just anybody's worst nightmare. So yeah, it oftentimes, we talk about sexually motivated, it oftentimes I think boils down to this desire to just dominate and control that person. And that may manifest itself in sexual acts or things around that. But that seems to be the real drive behind that.
Right, so we're talking about domination, manipulation, power, control, right? All of those things. Is that something that you've seen in your research and studies and dealing with this kind of stuff, like through many offenders, or is this something that's rarer or only to a particular group of offenders?
Well, it depends. When you look at, for example, serial rapist, you sometimes, depending upon, there's different types of rapists, for example. But I mean, there's certainly kind of the sexually sadistic rapist, who I think sometimes some people might argue that this is, for many of them, as a budding serial killer in the making. They just haven't progressed to that level. And when you look sometimes at the history of individuals, I mean, one who comes to mind, probably for you and me, is the Golden State Killer. Um,
Yeah.
who had these fetish burglaries for years. Then he moved and he became, a serial rapist, and then he became a sexually sadistic serial killer. That's not uncommon when you see that. So certainly when you're looking at certain types of sexual offenses, you can see some similarities, but not necessarily in terms of other kinds of crimes. I mean, when you were a police officer, you're dealing with crimes of people robbing for money, or things gone wrong, people getting in bar fights and somebody dying. I mean, the average, if there is one, crime does not involve some of the things we're talking about now.
Right. Yeah, no, yeah, far from it, right? And that kind
Mhm.
of stuff.
Right.
Would you be able to, I think you touched on it a little bit, but when we was, what is the McDonald triad?
The McDonald triad is animal cruelty, bedwetting, and fire setting. And that was a theory that was developed in the 1960s by a man who kind of noticed that a lot of violent offenders tended to have these three things in their background. And so, of course, we all ran with it and began doing all this research. And that really became this kind of predictor for a while of if somebody is going to be a murderer, particularly a premeditated murderer, they're going to torture animals always, they're going to be bedwetting, they're going to be, when I say bedwetting, I mean past, for example, the age of 6. So a lot of kids, as they're learning to control themselves, will make mistakes and wet the bed. We're talking about an extended amount of time, or they'll experiment with fire. Well, we've since learned a couple of things that really have debunked that idea. One is, while you certainly do see a larger percentage, for example, of people who abuse animals who also hurt people, there is definitely a relationship between animal cruelty and cruelty to people. The majority of serial killers, for example, have not abused animals. So you're going to get a significant minority. I think it might be like 36%, which is a very high percentage, but it's not 90%. It's not, if this person does this, then they're going to do this. And I can tell you, as somebody who interviews violent offenders weekly, I see plenty of people who would never hurt an animal and who have done horrific things to human beings. So there's a relationship, but it's not a perfect relationship. We've also learned that, of course, when you're talking about bedwetting, it really isn't even if anything, it can be a sign of trauma. So if physical problems have been ruled out, which of course, this wasn't even the thought at that time, a certain number of people have physical problems that cause bedwetting, and they may be 10 or 11 or 12 and still wetting the bed for physical reasons. If that's ruled out and a person or a child is engaging in bedwetting, it may be a sign of trauma. As fire setting is the same thing. There's a higher percentage of people who commit violent offenses who probably set fires when they were younger, but it certainly isn't a perfect correlation. So I think the way we're looking at that now is that, yes, for example, if animal cruelty exists over the age of 10, if it involves torture, if it's premeditated, that is a red flag for something. I mean,
Right.
it should never be ignored, but it does not, none of those in of themselves mean that this is a budding serial killer.
Right. So, I mean, we do know that biology, right, experience and environment plays a big role in some of these guys, right? I mean, and research tells us that.
It absolutely does. I mean, that's just one of the most challenging and as a psychologist, the most fascinating things to me is that we are as human beings are so complicated. And we are pretty good at this point at predicting groups. We'll say, like I was saying, 36% of this group is likely to do this. It's so much harder to predict what one person will do because we're all individuals. So you're right. When you look at the background, for example, of a sexually motivated serial killer, you can often find some commonalities, but you can also sometimes find differences. And we find times, there have been times we've seen people who had a normal childhood and we're
Right.
like, what happened to this person? And we don't know. And the only thing we can think of is, okay, for this particular person, was the genetic loading so great for this person in terms of, not in terms of a genetic loading for being a serial killer, there's no such thing, but the genetic loading in terms of lack of empathy, for example, something missing in this person. They just, had some kind of maybe predisposition to psychopathy, and it didn't take as much in the environment or growing up for them to kind of develop. That's the piece that's so hard for us to figure out sometimes, because we know that a serial killer is a puzzle in the sense that all these pieces come together to create this person, but we can find pieces of each in this puzzle that fit a lot of different people who would never become that.
Right. Yeah, no, it's interesting because I always say Vinny the Chin Gigante, who was the head of one of the crime families in New York City, his brother was a priest, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, same environment, same home,
Yeah.
same parents, same everything. So, biology had to play a bigger role into something like that. But I just wanted to take a shout out here to Arizona girl. Hello, Sarge from Tucson, Arizona. Thank you for your service. Love your channel and engaging content. FYI, Joshua Ritter sent me. Thank you, Arizona gal. And someone had posted when I mentioned the show earlier. Joni, they said she looks just like Ashley Judd. Have you ever gotten that before? Have you ever gotten
Well,
that?
whoever said that, thank you, thank you, thank you. I've rarely gotten that, and the few times I have, I'm very appreciative. So
Yeah, I see the resemblance actually when she first said it. I said, "Wow, there is actually a kind of resemblance there. That's pretty funny." So, what kind of things should investigators be looking at when you're talking about some of these situations? Because sometimes these things go unnoticed at a crime scene. So, are there behavioral clues that sometimes they leave behind?
I mean, I think there certainly are, and these are probably not things necessarily that investigators would overlook, but I think they are significant things. And I think it's, when you have a victim who's disposed outside, for example, when you have a victim who is bound in any way. I mean, I think that is certainly a clue, because we know that there's a correlation between a sexually motivated murderer and somebody who's bound or in some certain way. You're looking, obviously, when you have multiple crime scenes, you're looking at for some kind of psychological signature, which is very different from the MO, which can change. And that's been something that I think has been very humbling to a lot of researchers in the past, maybe 5 to 10 years. We used to feel like, okay, if this person is a serial killer, they're going to kill this, each person in the same way. That's going to be their signature. Well, we know that's not true. But what we do find sometimes, and I think this is important, especially across crime scenes, is they may not bind the person with a rope. They may have a person who's now bound with a scarf, or bound in some other way, confined in some other way. You are more likely to see that binding or confining across situations. So it's not necessarily looking at, okay, did they use the same thing, but did they psychologically treat this person the same way? And I think that's important to track across situations. I'm trying to think what else kind of stands out in terms of, obviously victim selection, which can be tricky, because the other thing
Right.
that we used to find with serial killers, we used to think, okay, if serial killers are, or for example, murdering sex workers, they're always going to murder sex workers. That's not true. We know that about a third of serial killers will murder people they know, and they'll also murder sex workers. So I think we've learned, if anything, to pay attention to patterns that are broader patterns in terms of how this person is engaging with their victim. Are they leaving this person again outside? And they don't have to be exposing. They don't have to be posed in the same way, but are they posed? So looking at things, I think, from a broader perspective, and also not expecting things to be exactly the same.
Right. No, yeah, that's actually kind of interesting because it's kind of going to lead us to segue into the Long Island serial killer case, because some of the things you touched on, right? We have bound, we have sex workers, we have a lot of that stuff. But before I do ask that question, I mean, something unique about Long Island in 1993, we have potentially four serial killers operating at the same time: Joel Rifkin, Robert Schulman, John Bitroff, who's technically the definition, he's borderline, and now allegedly Rex Heuermann. Is that something unusual that you have that many people operating at the same time?
Yes, it is unusual. Now, it's not unheard of because we
Right.
know, like in the 70s and 80s, I think at one point, there were like 6 or 7 serial killers in LA at the same time, which is just mind boggling, or at least in that area. And I think that speaks to a couple of things. One is, you were kind of talking about California and the population, but I think it probably is more than that, particularly when you're looking at like LA, because you think, okay, who goes to LA and for what reason? So you're going to have perhaps a larger victim pool in California, right? Depending upon what that person's looking for. You're going to have more anonymity in terms of people are transient. They move to LA for certain things. So I think it is not just the population. I think it's other things as well. And so in some respects, it's frightening to think of that. But I think when you have a large city and you have places for people to hide, you have a large potential victim pool, which is a horrible thing to think about, but it's true. It makes sense that you're going to attract people who are wanting to prey on that population and have easy access and can be more anonymous.
Yeah, you can hide in plain sight because there's
Exactly.
so many people that are around. Simi Sharp has a good question here. Let's see if we can. So I'm curious, what percentage of serial killers start close to home, i.e., family, friends, neighbors? Just curious. Is that something that we see?
That's a very good question. Typically, again, if we're talking about sexually motivated serial killers, they don't tend to start with that person because they're more likely to get caught. So there have been a couple of serial killers who've gotten caught by ending with somebody that they knew. I'm thinking of one out in California who he was a trucker, and he had murdered several women. And then he ended up getting angry at this woman he had dated, and he murdered her. And that's how he got caught. So now, on the other hand, if you're talking about female serial killers, so female serial killers are more likely to kill people they're close to. So they oftentimes will start and finish with people close to them, whether it's a spouse, parents, friends, boyfriend, acquaintance. They're much more likely to trap their victims as opposed to hunting their victims, which is why we see, for example, you have more female serial killers who use poisoning as a way to kill that person, as opposed to going out and shooting them or strangling them, or those kinds of things.
Yeah, it's actually kind of interesting, right? So we have, different genders kind of start off different ways, kind of stuff too. But we saw what Carolyn Ann Warmers, right? She was probably did she kind of put the female serial killers on the map kind of thing? Or was there somebody beforehand? I mean, she was picking up Johns, right? And then
Well, you know what's so funny about that? I mean, not funny, but like
I
interesting.
understand.
Not
Yeah,
nothing. There's nothing
interesting.
funny about this,
Right.
but
No, no,
interesting as a
yeah, we
topic
get it. Yep.
is Aileen Wuornos. I mean, I remember when she was called the first female serial killer, which of course was completely untrue, completely untrue. And I think the reason for that is because she was operating like we thought of as male serial killers operating. She's killing strangers. She's shooting them. She's kind of going out basically in some respects hunting people. So when she was caught, it was like, oh my God, this is the first female serial killer. Not noticing that there were, for example, baby farmers, women who used to essentially, this is back in the 1800s, who used to agree to take care of children that single moms could no longer take care of, and would promise to find that child a home. And of course, this was not most people who were in this profession, and, murdered maybe hundreds of infants. So we've had female serial killers probably as long as we've had male serial killers. We just didn't think of them as serial killers. So when Aileen Wuornos came along, and she's out there, on the highway, and she's shooting people or stabbing them, and she's targeting strangers, and she's operating like a quote male serial killer. And that's why there was this big to do. And I think she did put female serial killers on the map.
Yeah, no, I mean she's an interesting case for sure in a lot of different ways. But when we're talking about Long Island, and now we have allegedly Rex Heuermann, who's on trial for right now for, well, he's not trial yet, but he's going to be on trial probably in the next couple of months for the murder and dismemberment of many of the victims on GIlgo, right? So he's been charged with 7. Not all of them. There's still a sets of 10 sets of remains, and then I say 10 sets of remains, and then Shannon Gilbert, because that's a kind of outlier in the whole case. So there's
Yeah.
11 bodies located within a short general vicinity of this. And from the beginning, I was a one serial killer suspect from the beginning, and based on the fact that, and correct me if I'm wrong, because we're talking about this, the fact that we had somebody who was cutting up individuals that he picked up on the street, and maybe somebody might have seen him get in the car, and then now all of a sudden he would have that as a way, because we know he had a planning document, which I want to get into. But and then all of a sudden the internet comes around and burner phones, and so now all of a sudden his mo changes, and that was my theory from the beginning, that technology changed his mo and nothing else. But there's always outliers, right? Sandra Castilla now is added to it, and it is a case from the first one now, where technically that stuff wasn't in existence. But that was kind of my first thinking. Is there any validity to that, do you think, or it could have been something else that,
To the fact that his MO changed,
yeah, based on technology?
I completely agree with you. I mean, you think about, I mean, it's horrible to think of serial killers learning and adapting and using, because we don't want them to. We want to catch them, right? But that's just
Right.
not true. So, for example, if you had a serial killer who, cut up the body of the first couple and then started thinking, I don't need to do this. Nobody even notices that these people are missing. I can just dispose them over here. It may not be that anything has changed psychologically for that person. It just may be, I don't need to do that anymore. Or I feel I'm more confident than I was in the past, that I can get away with this. I found my spot. The flip side of that, so this is somebody who's kind of becoming perhaps more careless, which we see people get caught sometimes because they become more careless over time. Or somebody who, oh my gosh, this is so much easier. I don't have to go out and patrol the streets and find somebody to try to pick up. I can just use the internet. So absolutely, we definitely see. We've seen serial killers where one person is either gagged, and they're all bound, but one is gagged and the other is not, and it becomes, why wasn't this one gagged? Well, because I had her where she didn't care if, I didn't matter, didn't care if she screamed or not. Nobody could hear her. So there's always some practical considerations, and certainly when you have somebody who has technology, they like learn technology, they have an easier way. Maybe they think they're less traceable. Yes, I completely agree with you.
Yeah, and now that we learned, through one of the, well, actually the probable cause affidavit, that he had a very detailed list and a plan that he was going to do, including reading John Douglas's Mindhunter book. Now, when you first heard that as a forensic psychologist, because I'm sure you've either read it or know, I'm sure you know of John Douglas and the whole profiling bit. But what was your first kind of feeling, or what did you get when you first heard that he was reading this book and doing his research?
Yeah, it's pretty creepy. I mean, when you think about it, I mean, it wasn't a big surprise. I mean, we know there have been serial killers who've studied other killers. They've researched forensics. They've, kind of made it a hobby, if you will. Israel Keys was famous for doing that. He would study other killers and kind of make a little, document about what not to do, because he had a lot of disdain for the ones who got caught. And so, of course, that's just studying other serial killers. But if you have somebody who's ambitious in this way, doesn't surprise me this person would be. Would be studying. But what do the profilers say? What do they think the psychology is? Maybe there's some attempt to self-understand himself in this as well. Do I fit the
Yeah.
profile that John, can I get some insight about myself? I mean, look at the couple of serial killers who, had criminology degrees or criminal justice degrees, like Dennis Rader. So I think there's oftentimes when you're looking at those kinds of things, it may have serve a dual purpose, right? This kind of attempt to understand themselves and get better at what they want to do.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was actually pretty detailed, this document that they were able to recover. I mean, talk about, of course, surveillance cameras. He was worried about them. He was worried about, somebody might have seen him, and he actually had things detailed along the highways about where cameras or potential things were. It was actually kind of interesting, and I think his internet searches, which I think we only get a little taste of it, we're going to get the most of it at trial.
Mhm.
200 times, I think he looked up Long Island serial killer. about, why haven't they caught him, and about cell phone technology. So we're kind of getting a little insight into this guy that we've all, believe that they got the right guy, and then now it's going to be up to a judge and the jury to see if he is guilty or not. But I think the evidence is piling up.
Yeah, I think it has been piling up more and more. I mean, it sounds like some of the documents that they recovered were pretty damning from what's become
Yeah.
public. It's hard to explain those away.
And I want to know what they found in those storage facilities. That I remember the police commissioner at the time, when they asked him at a press conference, he said it was fruitful. So, I mean, a better word than that, I don't think we can get, right. So
Yeah.
you're kind of dealing with this, but yeah, fruitful. But it's actually interesting because he kept, I think they said 50 hotel keys. I guess those kind of, I doubt it's like the old traditional motel keys where it was actually physical key. One of those kind of access cards. You think, would that be something in the trophy category? Would you kind of put that in there? In that, I don't want to put
It's
words in your mouth, but
interesting.
yeah.
He's complicated in the sense that he was a hoarder, it sounds like, as well, right? So,
Oh
I
yeah.
mean, I think there was probably, I have no doubt that he has trophies. Now, if this was part of them, I would not be surprised either. But I do think we have to be somewhat cautious and say, okay, this guy seemed to keep everything. He was a
Yeah.
pack rat. But at the same time, if you're keeping 50 hotel keys, it's one thing if you have trouble throwing things away in your house and you're
Yeah.
collecting things. It's another thing when you can't get rid of hotel keys. So I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if that's part of his trophy collection, but I would be surprised if that's all he kept.
Yeah, I would too. I mean, he kept, I think, 400 plus electronic devices,
Yeah.
including Palm Pilots. I mean, talk about a treasure trove. I mean, good grief. I think people are going to actually be floored when they actually start laying out some of the electronic evidence in this case. I really do. I think it's going to be absolutely huge.
I mean, it was mind-boggling to hear all the things they found in there. It seemed like it was almost like they had to maneuver their way in when they went into the house. It was so filled with stuff.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw because there's going to be a Peacock show that's going to be dropping soon. I think it comes out, I think, in mid-June, on the whole thing with his wife, Asa. And I don't know if you saw the coming attractions, they have a picture of her in the basement in front of the vault. Did you see this?
No, I haven't seen it.
Yes. As yeah, so 50 Cent is really going for the shock factor there. I saw the picture. She's sitting in the basement. They have her on a chair. Behind her is the vault, in the basement, and that's the promo picture for the show coming up. So I know some people, were very upset out of that. I can understand that, but I guess from the marketing position, it was the way that they wanted to go. But we're we're dealing with maybe historically a guy with that's sadistic kind of torture. I mean, he was tying girls up using belts, all kinds of stuff, and then his document about rest. Make sure you have enough rest so there's more playtime.
Yeah. I mean,
I
it's
mean,
just, he really, I mean, sexually motivated serial killers, and that may include Rex Heuermann. It certainly looks like it from what we've seen publicly. It really is the boogeyman. I mean, it's anybody's worst nightmare in terms of, it's one thing. I mean, in the realm, and they're just the realm of horror. Someone who gets physical pleasure out of that kind of domination and control and torture and those kinds of things. I mean, I can't imagine anything worse.
yeah, no. And if you're just joining us now, we're up to 180 people watching us live. We're with Dr. Joni Johnston, forensic psychologist, and we're just talking about her latest book. And of course, we have segued into Rex Heuermann and the Long Island serial killer. But Nightbot is sharing her links for her webpage and her latest book, Serial Killers 101 Questions That True Crime Fans Ask. And they ask her probably a lot through email, right? You get all those things.
Well,
What?
you know where I got those, Joe, is because it's not an easy title to say. I'm realizing
Yeah.
it as you're saying it, which I appreciate. Is I write a blog for Psychology Today, and I've been
Mhm.
doing it since 2007. And so it's on law and crime, and I write about psychology and forensic psychology. And there literally were questions that my readers had asked me over the years. So I kind of kept a running tally of them. And then when COVID hit, I thought, you know what, I'm going to sit down and make sure I know the answer to all these questions, or at least I've researched it as much as anybody can. So when I get another question about whatever it is, serial killer related, I can be somewhat prepared. So they actually really were questions that came from readers, over the years.
Without giving all the family secrets away out of the book, what was one question that you kind of found was like one of the most interesting kind of questions that you had, or like maybe like, wow, I never thought of that. Let me start looking into that.
I tell you one that, yeah, I kind of really went down the rabbit hole in a way with this category because I got a couple. I get think because it was an unusual question because most of the questions are, what is a serial killer? Or are they born or made? And but I got a question about serial killers in other countries, and are they different from serial killers in the United States? And I started kind of going. I was familiar with some of them, but I started really going down the rabbit hole and looking, and I just found so many interesting things when I did this. So, for example, one of the things that really struck me was how who is vulnerable can vary depending upon the country. And you'll see predators target those populations. So, for example, in South Africa, it was not uncommon for sexually motivated serial killers to offer a young woman work because unemployment was so difficult there. And so it was a way that you could kind of catch this person, right? This person needed work, this person needed money. And so as opposed to offering drugs, for example, or something like that, you would see that kind of MO happening, which I thought was kind of interesting. But one of the ones that was the most disturbing to me was, I read about this serial killer in Pakistan who killed 100 young children before he was caught. And I just could not understand that initially. It was kind of mind boggling to me. And then what I realized is that there is a lot of poverty in this certain area. And so a lot of the times children are on the streets trying to help their families survive. So they're begging or they're, oftentimes unsupervised because of the economics. And so also because of the economics, there's a certain amount of petty crime that goes on, pickpocketing and things like that, because they're trying to, again, help feed themselves and feed their family. And so there seems to be sometimes, a disdain almost because, you don't want you don't want to get your pockets picked. And so we can't imagine 100 children being murdered in the United States without somebody noticing. But that was what was happening because there wasn't any concern about these kids. These are street kids, right there. And so it was really interesting to me to look at that and to kind of, it really made me start thinking about what does this mean that there are people in every society that we don't care for as much. We don't take care of maybe as much as we should, or, and it's interesting when it's not as easy to see necessarily when we're in our own country. But we look at the number of homeless people who've been murdered, or, you start seeing that the oftentimes groups who are targeted or preyed upon are groups that, as a society, we have not cared for as much, or we don't put as much value on.
Marginalized. Yeah. Marginalized.
Yeah.
Sinead's got a great question here, and it's revolving Rex. Says, what would his relationship have been like with his wife? How could he mask his behavior around other women? Dissociation? Question mark.
That is such a great question. I'm so glad one of your our watchers or viewers.
I have the best. I have the best viewers. They have some awesome questions.
I bet. It's not hard for me to believe. And I will tell you, I'm somewhat opinionated about this. So for what that's worth, I'll tell you that. But a couple of things. One is, I think that all of us, to some extent, have the ability to compartmentalize our lives, right? I mean, and one of my examples I use, and I'm sure you've heard this, Joe, is, you're out there on the streets and you see a child has been murdered and it's just horrendous. You go home and you have a child the same age who's waiting at the door for you to play. You got to do something with that, right? You can't bring that home into the room. I mean, you can, but you don't want to. So you find a box somewhere in your head, right? And you open a drawer, you put it in there, and it goes somewhere, at least temporarily, it goes somewhere, because that allows you to function and, to be a dad and do all those fun things, no matter how you might be feeling on the inside. Well, I think this is, in some respects, an extreme, compartmentalization on the one hand. And Dennis Rader, in the book he wrote with Catherine Ramsland, called it cubing. where he would say he could just kind of flip himself, from person to person with whatever he needed to be. So I think there is a sense of compartmentalization. That person, just plays a role to some extent. They become a different person with whoever that they're with. And then I think I think for some people it's scary how easy it is to do that. I mean, we've just seen, even some of I won't go down that rabbit hole, but yeah, I mean, it's scary to see how,
Yeah.
I get so interested in this stuff.
That's okay. That's why we have you. Yeah, we're interested.
Thanks. So that's one thing I would say. And I think the other thing I would say is, one of the things that's always hard for me to hear, I think, is how could she not know? How could she not know? I mean, surely there were some signs. And I mean, if you hear interviews with former spouses of serial killers, first of all, it ranges the gamut. I mean, you can find serial killers who beat the crap out of their wives. And, nobody was surprised this person was violent because he'd been violent with everybody. You can find people who seemed to be an honest, upstanding family man with 2 kids. Nobody had any idea. So I think you run the gamut. But what I would say is that I think relationships are based on trust. And there certainly have been women that I've researched who've said, I know something was off. I thought he was having an affair. That's the most common thing. I thought he was having an affair. He disappeared for hours. Most of us would not go straight to, I think my husband's a serial killer. We might think something, maybe he's having an affair, maybe he's going out to visit a sex worker, those kinds of things. So I think it's very possible for somebody to do all kinds of things. I always laugh and go, my husband goes to yoga every day. But you know what? I've never gone over to the yoga studio to check on him. I mean, I haven't. I trust. I mean, he has a yoga mat. He gets on a bicycle. He's sweaty when he gets home. But I mean, he could be doing all kinds of things, right? Our relationship. So there's got to be a certain amount of trust in a relationship, right, for it to continue. And so I think it's unfair sometimes unless we have clear evidence. Right. Unless we have evidence that this person participated, this person knew, then it's a different story. But until we do, or unless we do, I think it really is unfair to be looking at any family member and saying you should have known.
Yeah, no, and specifically the district attorney, and this is one of the first times I've ever seen this. He has made a great effort from the very beginning to say there is no evidence that she was involved in any of this stuff. And they went out of their way. They even put it in the probable cause affidavit that when these crimes happened, she was out of town. And he's said this numerous times because I guess he felt that there was going to be some serious backlash on this. But she hasn't done herself any favors either. In regards to some of the comments that she's made and some of the other things. I mean, in the beginning specifically, she was not a likable character.
Yeah.
Let's
And
put it that
I
way.
understand. I mean, it's horrific. And so I understand that. I mean, there's no doubt that when you're in a family and somebody is a horrendous thing, we expect people to behave in a certain way. We want them to be sympathetic. We want them to be victims. We want to feel bad for them. And if people aren't acting that way, it's maddening for a lot of people. So I understand that. I'm just saying there is a big gap, as you pointed out, Joe, between somebody not acting the way we think they should, or the way we would maybe act or think it's appropriate, and somebody being a collaborator in something horrendous.
Brad has got a question, which is going to lead right into my next segment. It says, Brad says, Joe, ask her what comes up inside a serial killer that causes them to keep on doing it. Now, and that's going to segue into this question because something to me that I've been struggling with, and that is from the time he's arrested to the time that the last victim is found, right? We don't know if that's technically the last victim, but the last victim was found in April of 2011. He gets arrested July, I think it's 13th of 2023. So we're looking at 12 plus years. Now we know the definition of a serial killer says there's a cool off period, but is 12 and a half years something unusual for somebody who was actually looked like they were getting closer and closer up into that point?
Yeah. I mean, we don't know, right? We don't know if this guy has other victims out there. So a couple of things about that. So let me address the viewer who asked the question first of all. So I think it depends. I mean, there are many sexually motivated serial killers will say that they have this compulsion or it became an addiction. As a matter of fact, there have been some who started out as, serial sexual assaulters, and they actually killed somebody by accident and liked it. At least that's the story that they've given. Is that true? We don't know. And then at that point, it became a progression. We'll just put it that way. So we do know that there seems to be this kind of escalation over time. And that for at least a significant or a certain percentage of them will claim that there's an addictive component, that it's like this, that's the cooling off period, that once they commit a murder, they kind of feel satiated afterwards, or kind of the stress, kind of goes away. Over time, life goes on. They start fantasizing again. They start having, bad things happen in their environment. They get stressed or whatever, and that pressure builds up and they do it again. Now, I don't think it's that simple, and I don't think everybody operates that way. I think that's a pattern that we see. I don't think you and I have never heard of a serial killer who's killed somebody in front of a cop, right? Watching. Yeah. So there's a certain amount of self-control that people have, no matter how much that pressure builds up. There's always a certain amount of self-control. To some extent, it's always a choice. But there is, I think, this kind of compulsion and escalation that does often happen. And so I think that's kind of this buildup that happens sometimes for people. However, as you just pointed out, there have been, let's say for a minute that Rex Heuermann is the Long Island serial killer. Let's say that he didn't kill anybody for 12 years, which we're not sure about and have our doubts about, for sure. There certainly have been people, Dennis Rader being one of them, BTK, who quit for years. We know that. At least there's never been any link to any other victims. He's never been accused of any other crimes. He confessed to a lot of crimes. Is it possible he did? But I don't think he did. There have been other people who have talked about a couple of things. One, either their life circumstances changed, they got married, they were happy for a period of time, they quit doing it. Or they began using other autoerotic asphyxiation. They began doing other things, either in the interim, or they were scared they're going to get caught. They were able to delay, or they were in jail. There's all kinds of reasons. There are these gaps. And then you find people like Joseph James D'Angelo, who kind of aged out of it. When he was caught, he hadn't killed anybody for 20, 30 years. He just got to the point where he's like, I don't want to do it anymore. I don't need to do it anymore. So yes, it's not common for a sexually motivated serial killer to take 12 years off. And I have my doubts, given the fact that he was doing some behaviors and continuing to talk to sex workers. That concerns me. That doesn't sound like somebody who's cooled off permanently.
Right.
But he would not be the first person, if that is true.
Yeah, no, specifically when they have the videos of him, the surveillance video, paying in cash for new burner phones, and then for the police to act pretty quickly, because they kind of gave a little hint that that they had to move now in order to do something, because the word that the commissioner used at the time was demon. This guy's a demon. So something was afoot, right? We could speculate all day long why they moved that fast, but I think we can all kind of figure out why. One of the things here that came up, Sarah asked a good question here, because even though we only have a few minutes left, this is actually an interesting thing. There's something going on in New England. I've been looking into all these cases. They found some more human remains today. Different MOs, a lot of crazy stuff going on up there, but I'm sure you're going to be pulled out on the carpet eventually when this thing finally hits. But the police are very reluctant, and they always will be, to say the word serial. I don't see it here yet, but I'll tell you, there's something definitely going on under the surface here. So have you been following this?
I agree with you. There's something going on, and I'm with you. I'm not ready, because there have been a couple of victims. It seems like they know who did it. So I think that probably everybody they've recovered, if there is a serial killer in New England, is not all part of that pattern. And so I think that's kind of muddying the waters a little bit. But I would say that I have a hard time. And again, this is maybe a little bit of Monday morning quarterbacking here. You can probably speak to this better than I can, Joe. But to me, it's like, one of the benefits of true crime, I think, has been that people are more sophisticated. It could try consumers. They want to know things, and they're much less, I guess, accepting of, don't worry about it, nobody's in any danger. And so to me, if these questions are being raised, and they should be being raised at this point, because something is going on, we don't know what that is. To me, and again, you'll have to answer this from a police perspective, just looking at it from a crisis management perspective, it would make sense to me to come out and say something along the lines of, we are actively researching every possibility, including the possibility that this is a serial killer. We will keep the public informed when we know something further, we will be letting you know. That to me is a easier message and a more trustworthy message than no, there's no serial killer. No, there's no serial killer.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think they came out too fast with the this is not a serial killer thing, just because of all the media that's on top of this, including the social media stuff. But I could tell you, when you look at the map, what I do is when I see something like this, and you probably do the same thing, I start circling clusters and take a look at it. And then you have to, it's a lot of research involved, guys. You have to then take those 4 or 5 cases that are close proximity and read about them, because you might find out that the MOs are entirely different, or one was a domestic homicide, and so it kind of changes a lot of different things. So you have to take a look at this stuff, but I think there's something definitely bubbling up there, and I think everybody's going to keep a close eye on it to see what's going on. Dr. Joni, this was fantastic. I hope you can come back again in the future.
I would love
And
it.
yep, and I know you're very busy, but we want to thank you for your time tonight, and we appreciate. Is there any final thought or anything about the book or anything that you want to tell us that I didn't mention? And
Other than to sing your praises, Joe, I can't think of anything else. I just have really enjoyed so much hearing you appear on all these different media platforms and really respect what you do. And so I was really honored to be included in your show tonight.
oh, it's an honor to have you, Doctor. I mean, it was great. Like I said, I could talk to you for hours. But everybody, thanks for showing up tonight. Thanks for coming in. Dr. Joni, thank you very much. And we'll see you relatively soon, I'm sure, on a TV show or another podcast. But thank you again for your time tonight.
You're welcome.